Welcome. My name is Anne-Marie Fleming, Strategic Marketing Manager with FINCAD, and thank you very much to everyone watching this webcast, which is going to be an interesting one because what it's going to cover is some specific research that was recently conducted by Celent, which is titled Optimizing the OTC Derivatives Pricing and Valuation Infrastructure. And what this is really a look at sort of the true cost of financial analytics, which really should get organizations rethinking that build versus buy decision. And so presenting this research, we have Cubillas Ding, who is the research director with Celent, and he'll be taking us through those results and some of the conclusions that they drew from that research. And we also have Bob Park, President and CEO of FINCAD, who will be taking us through a bit of a history lesson, explaining how far the OTC derivatives market has come, as well as the financial analytics market, and some of those drivers behind this evolution. So at this time, I'd like to pass the presentation over to Cubillas Ding.
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Cubillas Ding, and good morning or good afternoon, wherever you may be signing on from. What I'd like to do today is run through key findings from our recent study that examined the costs of deploying derivative analytics for the pricing and valuation of OTC trades. The research basically started off with the premise that there are many cost components, both explicit and implicit, if an institution decides to meet its need for OTC derivatives pricing and valuation using in-house approaches and systems. And so the report basically aims to identify these cost components and uses best efforts to actually quantify them. And for this study, we aimed to firstly bring to the forefront issues related to cost efficiency in the deployment of analytics, and subsequently provide an independent analysis of the true costs of OTC pricing and valuation activities. And then finally suggest recommendations to improve the economics of getting analytics to market in an effective and cost-effective manner. Now, this particular diagram basically shows the OTC derivatives trade processing cycle, and we see that over the last 2 years or so during the financial crisis, the challenges and issues have not particularly changed significantly, even though the pressures for reform has intensified. Now, the key issues here for firms trading in OTC markets are basically around issues such as the lack of transparency, being able to manage escalating overheads as a result of needing to address regulator and investor concerns, as well as FTP-related issues that you all know about. However, what has changed with the recent financial crisis is that risk and control functions are now heavily emphasized, not just around operational controls, but also around how data, analytics, and assumptions are actually derived. And here, transparency and control over the inner mechanics of a model is critical and often cited as one of the important reasons for in-house development. Secondly, where previously there was little real collaboration between the front office, financial control, and risk functions, there is noticeably a more concerted push to ensure that deal information, pricing models, and assumptions and approval flows are reviewed and verified as a whole. And so the key takeout here is that with additional layers of what I would term as parallel activities around risk control and counter checks and balances, there is a need to balance how much controls is sufficient versus cost overheads that are involved in the process. Now, this slide shows the different parts of a firm that require and use analytics, price data, as well as the functions that are involved. And this particular schematic illustrates a typical setup for a fixed income and credit trading shop. Most derivatives trading desks that we know are organized around asset classes and then further divided into geo-specific and typically disjointed front, middle, and back office approaches are taken. And hence the usage of analytics and models and its technology development, infrastructure, and activities unfortunately also reflect the reality of being organized in this uncoordinated manner. And this typically results in fragmentation, operational inefficiencies, and complexity risks for the firm. Now, as a general principle, the magnitude of cost overheads that a firm is dependent on its operations and technology configuration. That is, the more fragmented and non-standardized it is, the higher degree of complexity and therefore cost overheads are actually incurred. Now, this diagram is a framework that we have used in the report for examining the analytic infrastructure and components that are involved. And I won't elaborate each component in detail, but basically this serves to show the software development lifecycle activities and where the costs lie. Now, if you follow from the previous slide, for each of the separate what I termed as non-coordinated activity within the front, middle, or back office, an organization will need to go through the following development stages to derive prices, valuations, and risk measures associated with each OTC deal. And the costs here basically include direct items such as development personnel or activities related to integration of third-party systems, documentation, maintenance and support, as well as licenses for third-party components. Now, in addition to these explicit, what I would term as quantifiable costs, there are also implicit, often difficult to quantify elements such as productivity issues, the cost of inconsistencies such as for reconciliation activities and for operational losses from model errors, for instance, that are also present that cannot be quantified directly as a whole. And so the key takeout here is that if a firm truly considers what's involved, there are many points of analytics development and consumptions that are costly to a firm both directly and indirectly as a whole. Now, if then one poses the question of how costly it can become, our conclusions from the study would suggest that based on conservative assumptions, the development expenditures for a multi-asset class library alone would cost in excess of $9 million, and if we involve 30 persons, it would take more than 12 months to actually build. And the costs here are basically takes into account what we term as loaded labor rates, which include both direct salary costs as well as indirect costs such as the cost of benefits, vacation time, facilities, and so on. And so the numbers that we have here are basically significant in itself for development efforts, but the costs that are incurred here basically do not end here. Beyond the initial development, build, and test phases, there are recurring costs that arise after the components are released into production. First, support and maintenance costs, which include sustaining activities and bug and error fixes and things like that, which we estimate to be about 10% of initial costs per annum. Secondly, there is also a cost component which we identify as evolve and enhancement costs. And basically, these are activities to enhance or build up the analytics libraries in order to keep up with ongoing product innovation and financial engineering. And this is basically an area where we find significant differences between firms in terms of how much they reinvest to keep their analytics libraries at the cutting edge. And different firms will adopt different levels of aggressiveness, and this can range from 25% to 50% of initial costs per annum over a 5-year production cycle. And so in total, over the entire software lifecycle, a firm pursuing an in-house approach can spend between 25 to 36 million just on derivatives analytics alone for the costs that we can realistically quantify. The other unknown costs related to things like systems integration of fragmented libraries, the alignment of front, middle, and back office analytics, and things like the time diversion aspect of quants taken away from core research and design activities, things like that. These are all intangibles which are difficult to actually put a number on. So in fact, we believe that most organizations are largely unaware of how much they spend on analytics at a firm-wide level, especially if one considers indirect costs, inefficiencies, and integration expenditures. And so In addition to the build and versus buy deliberation that we've talked about here, there are also other levers that firms can actually push in order to address effectiveness and also improve the cost of ownership related to analytics. And here, to achieve this, firms must make trade-offs with regards to a number of dimensions, such as analytic centralization, issues around data ownership, adopting different development lifecycle approaches, and putting in place proper model governance processes and also technology standardization efforts that can be pursued. Now, there is one particular aspect I like to expand and draw out here. That's with the final bullet point. And here, our experience has shown that best practice firms basically design their development processes to handle a mixture of different requirements according to the characteristics and circumstances of model usage. For example, based on factors such as model changeability, complexity, and criticality. For example, firms can execute their technology development approaches along different paths, and this is, we mentioned in the report, along 3 different paths, that is streamline development, scale development, and system development. And basically each path having differing time to market, scalability, and production quality levels. For instance, portfolio optimization and pricing analytics, which is used for deal and investment decision making, may have varying levels of complexity and criticality compared to, let's say, backtesting models. And so by delineating distinct development paths and approaches, institutions can deliver to business requirements more effectively as a whole. Now, with the rest of the points on this slide, I will just refer you to the report where these insights are actually covered in more detail as a whole. And so in conclusion, we see that the provisioning and deployment of derivative-related analytics is significant from a cost perspective. And if you then consider that in the light of emerging structural changes, things like mandatory capital requirements and more stringent accounting treatments of derivative deals in the coming years, firms will need to rethink build versus buy considerations. They will need to relook at development approaches and consider levels of standardization within different parts of the firm. And there are indeed opportunities here to actually optimize the delivery of OTC analytics, whilst at the same time manage escalating costs associated with the coming accounting and regulatory burdens in the coming years. And so with that, I would like to conclude my portion of the presentation and like to hand this over to Bob Park, the CEO of FINCAD, for the rest of the presentation as a whole. Thank you.